Here we go. Are we good, Patricia?
Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. This is Susan Gillis, Curator of the Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum. Welcome to our lecture series, Boca History 101. We have muted your mics, and please don't unmute or join with video because we are recording this session, and we're going to share the recording with everyone who signed up for the series. We'll send you a link to that. Today, I'm going to be talking about Boca Raton during World War II, Part 2. So last time we ended up talking about the acquisition of the field by eminent domain and how this signaled the end of the Yamato colony, amongst other things. So we know that about 300 of the 5,800 acres at the base belong to people with Japanese names. Some of these were actually people who had moved away, former colonists, like the Yoshida family, I noticed. However, there were 13 people left. The Kamiyas moved to Del Rey. The Kobayashis moved to Fort Lauderdale, went in the landscaping business. And we have two bachelors. George Murakami did not actually own property at Yamato. He owned a lot of property, but not at Yamato. But he lived there near the Kamiyas and so on. And he moved to Del Rey. Mr. Kamikama, his house was on the east side of Dixie Highway, so it was not on the base, and he didn't move. But this is, of course, not the entire story. According to Tom Kobayashi, who was a young man at the time, and you see him in his Army uniform, he was able to join the U.S. Army in '46. The federal government did freeze the assets of both George Murakami and Hideo Kobayashi, temporarily, but not very nice. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, federal agents came to the Kobayashi home and took a camera, Morse code kit, a Japanese dictionary, and a shortwave radio. These were later returned. Their travel was restricted, and Coast Guardsmen were assigned the families on a 24-hour basis. And Tom recalled in one article that one of the guardsmen was Italian-American. He said, you know, my uncle's from Italy, and at the time we were at war with Italy. He lives in New York, and nobody follows him to the farmer's market. So there was definitely prejudicial treatment here. But the very good news is that our Japanese Americans here in Florida, our Yamato folks, were not interned during the war. In contrast to the Pacific West Coast, Japanese Americans, California, Idaho, Utah, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, Arkansas, and Hawaii had internment camps. Why weren't our Yamato folks interned? Well, there are just not very many of them. Plus, they were very well incorporated into local society, economically, socially, culturally. As a matter of fact, I believe the Kamiyas belonged to the local Methodist church. They were not considered a threat. They didn't live in isolated enclaves or anything like that. So blessedly, they were not interned. Unfortunately, 3 of our former Yamato colonists were interned because they just found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, including Henry Kamiya, who happens to arrive in California on December 7th of 1941, and he ended up at Manzanar. Little postscript for you. So Murakami and Kamikama are bachelors, and they owned a lot of property throughout Boca Raton, which when they bought it, nobody wanted it. A lot of it was marshy with lots of bugs. And they own property between Federal Highway and the Intercoastal. Well, here comes the 1960s and everybody wants it. And they sell and become millionaires. when millionaire meant something. George, of course, goes on to donate some of his former farmland west of Delray Beach to the county to become the Murakami Japanese Museum and Garden. So a little poetic justice there. So back to BOCA RATON Field. We know there were over 800 buildings. Some of them were concrete block that was easily available down here, but most of them were wooden, even tar paper shacks, hastily constructed, known as T buildings, T allegedly for temporary. And we know that the base was built in what's called the dispersed layout pattern. And what this means is no streets or shrubs were moved to, no trees or shrubs were moved to build the streets or the buildings. So it looked as if they took the buildings and just threw them out like dominoes on the field. And we know about this because Arnold McSpadden, who was the engineer who designed the base and many other Air Force bases, actually retired to BOCA RATON. So we have his memories. The reason for doing this is that in case of an aerial attack by the enemy, a bomb would do a lot less damage if the buildings were not in the traditional regimented pattern all in a row, but rather scattered every which way. So this was on purpose, and this dispersed layout was applied to many wartime air bases. Now, if you look at the My Now and Then map, if you travel up BOCA RATON Boulevard, Northwest 2nd Avenue, between Palmetto and Yamato, you will see that the adjacent streets are not exactly on a nice grid system. And that's because most of them are actually artifacts of the war. So we have a pine circle, an oak circle, and a fourth diagonal. Who the heck has a street called Fourth Diagonal in their city? So this is part of the airbase, still existing. A view of the dispersed layout, kind of funny. This is the southeast corner of the base. We're looking west on Palmetto Park Road. That is the FEC tracks and Dixie Highway. Horizontally across the screen, the empty field is the future City Hall site. And that's where the water plant was. You can see it there, kind of where the parking lot to City Hall is today. To the south of Palmetto Park Road, those are not barracks. They look like barracks, but they're not barracks. This was the Palmetto Park project, a housing project, but not military. And we'll talk more about that in our next segment. But you can see to the center of the picture how crazily the buildings are constructed in this dispersed layout pattern. The arrow points to the rear of Town Hall. Here's another view. Now we're looking north and west. And you can see City Hall. So that water tower is about where our parking lot for City Hall is today in the community center. You can see the crazy layout of the buildings, and there's Fourth Diagonal in the distance. This is a view of what I think is the future Spanish River Boulevard, kind of wacky. And you can see it wasn't through over the tracks at that time. And in the distance, you see the runways of the base. I have some then and now for you. To your left is 42. That's the runways of the base. At the right is 2012. I think it needs no explanation. The yellow line on left is the Amtrak CSX tracks. The yellow line at right is the El Rio Canal, today the eastern limits of FAU. Here's a view from the west side of the base looking east. Those lines, those streets in the distance in the upper left, on the left picture, that's Villarica. And the now, the 2012, of course, once again, speaks for itself. A close-up of the runways of the base. This is the south end of the base. So this would be sort of the southeast corner of campus today, with the planes on the field, on the runways, and on the apron. That's where you park your planes, with a number of the hangars and adjacent buildings. I have a series of photos taken during the war by Sergeant John Barnes, who was a radar instructor. He probably could have been court-martialed for taking these pictures, or having them, I guess. But we're glad he did, and that he donated them to us. This is a view from south of 20th Street, looking north. Now, let me back up. 20th Street's kind of at the center of the picture. At your left, you can see canal. That is the El Rio Canal. And can you see the little bridge over the canal? So that's 20th. In the distance at left is BOQ, Bachelor Officers Quarters. These are the future T buildings on campus at FAU. You can see Pennsylvania is 1,343 miles away. We have two H-shaped buildings, and we call them H-shaped just because that's what the profile is from the air. That's not their official designation. And these were usually school buildings or something very important. They were CBS, they were concrete block. So we have north of 20th, the Ground Control Approach School, which we'll talk about in a minute. This was eventually the Mize Oaks Apartments, which has been demolished. And the other is the post office, obviously a very important wartime building. A view of the hangars of the base. T-15 hangar where I work. Power shelter for the school hangar. IFF stands for Identification Friend or Foe, very important application of radar. We have the operations shelter, maintenance shelter, school hut. In Briny Breezes, which is a mobile home park on A1A in Palm Beach County, one of my favorite places on the planet, by the way, they have a series of Quonset huts. And that's where they house, you know, the landscaping equipment and the art school and things like that. And they claim that they are salvage from the Boca Raton field. And I was a little skeptical of this. However, I must say they look exactly like our wartime Quonset huts, as you can see. Another picture by Barnes. Close, there's a canal. You can see the control tower, elevation 13 feet above sea level. The chute building, the parachute building, B-29, B-17, C-47, B-25s on the field in the distance. Why were we here? To learn radar, radio detecting and ranging. It was still very top secret. To mention the word radar off campus, you could be court-martialed. This is very serious stuff. And here we have Lieutenant Manny Chavez flight crew and guys learning to read the radar. So now I do not remotely pretend to be an expert in this technology, just kind of get the basics. But radar stands for radio detecting and ranging. It's a detection system that uses radio waves to determine the range, angle, velocity of objects. It can be used to detect aircraft, ships, spacecraft, guided missiles, motor vehicles, as we all know, weather formations, and terrain. And apparently it had been developed independently by the future World War II combatants by the 30s, by the mid-30s. But along comes 1939 and World War II, and all of a sudden Great Britain is in imminent threat of being invaded. And everyone says, wait a minute, now we understand the applications of this radar technology. So the British forge ahead with the technology. Long story short, they bring in their buddies, the Americans. The US has engineers, scientists, they have MIT, they have manufacturing plants, they have lots of spaces to put radar training bases. And we share the technology, and the US forges ahead in the technology as well. As a matter of fact, it's the Americans' name for radar, the acronym radio detecting and ranging, that everyone applies to the technology eventually. So even though the Germans had radar, they didn't have our radar. So naturally, they would be very happy to get their hands on some American technology, hence the continued need for secrecy. And here we have a picture that the future Dr. Charlie Bender took, and you can see some radar equipment on board a B-25. Here we have some radar instruction manuals that are part of our collection, and that is a radar tube. And it's a CRT, it's a little tiny television set. Now, the instruction was in 6-hour shifts. We noted it started at 6 o'clock in the morning, so that's pretty bad, isn't it? There were 3 shifts at least. Of course, you gave your name, rank, and serial number going in and going out. And according to some of our veterans, I believe you could take notes in class, but you could not leave with them. So imagine this complex technology and having to learn everything only in class. And remember, even though a lot of our students who volunteered for this training had an electronics background or were interested in electronics, many of them are from rural areas of the country where they probably didn't have a phone or radio going on, and they're thrust into this mid-20th century fairly complex technology. A lot of them flunked out. So it was very serious and required a lot of thought and effort and perseverance. A couple of specialty schools at Boca Raton Field, ground control approach. This is when you learn to assist landing planes with radar, pretty important function. And radar countermeasure. And this is when you obtain intel to try and jam the enemy's radio and radar communications. We also have some pictures of the antline. That's where the antenna, all varieties of antenna, the technology kept growing and moving and getting better every day on the runways, near the runways of the base. Pilots and mechanics, ground and air crews, instructors and administrators for the Air Corps, all coming through for training at Boca Raton Field. Here we have a B-24 with a group of pilots and B-17 being worked on by mechanics. For all you aviation airport fans out there, shout out to our airport. A few planes on the field, B-25 Mitchell, C-47, which is a transport plane, B-24 Liberator, and of course the workhorse, the B-17 Flying Fortress. A couple more fun artifacts. At left is a dead reckoning computer. And the reason I know that is because it says right on their dead reckoning computer. And this is for navigating with the old-fashioned way with a fixed point. At right is a lens for a runway light. And this was actually tripped over by one of our FAU donors. I was a little skeptical that it could be a wartime survivor, but there's a manufacturer's name molded into the glass. And sure enough, it is contemporary with World War II. Imagine that surviving all the bulldozers, road building equipment, pilings, all that at FAU campus, unscathed. Some more of our planes, a B-24 with some nose art, a B-47 Thunderbolt, the B-29 Super Fortress, and a B-34 Lexington. Now, there were a few crashes at the field, not too surprisingly. In 1944 was the worst, when 9 young men were killed. Now, our fire chief, Tom Wood, has become an authority on the Boca Raton Field Fire Department. And as he liked to tell me, Sue, the Boca Raton Field Fire Department, they were paid, whereas our Boca Raton Fire Department were still volunteers at the time. So he's done a great deal of research on this, and he was able to convince FAU to accept a state historical marker commemorating this sad event. The text of which he wrote, he applied for, and so on. And we say kudos to Chief Wood, because we, the Historical Society, have tried these many years to convince FAU to put any kind of marker dedicated to the Boca Raton field up somewhere on campus. And it's not that they don't think that's important or they aren't proud of their heritage. It's just that the people, the staff we usually deal with are extremely jealous of every square inch of real estate on campus. That hasn't changed. Of course, there was firearms training going on. The picture at the bottom makes me laugh. It's target box training. So yes, those guys have the target in between their legs in the distance, and they're waving. It looks like those things you put over your eyes when you have your eye tested. Okay, and they're waving that around for the young man to aim at. That looks dangerous to me. Chemical warfare training, gas mask training. We can see this, the guys suited up here. The building where the gassing is going on is actually located at the southwest corner of what is now Northwest 2nd Avenue and 20th Street. And in 1944, we got the shoot school parachute training. I don't really have a good picture of that for you, so here's a little close-up of the parachute building near the runways. The base was segregated. All the military was still segregated, and so our base was segregated as well. We know a little bit about this because of our friend Private Archie Carswell. And he told us that, number one, he never saw any Black officers at Boca Raton Field. That doesn't mean there weren't any, but there weren't any stationed here. They were all enlisted men. Everything was segregated. So the barracks were segregated. The lavatories were segregated. The PX was segregated. The mess hall was segregated. Even the movie theater, there was a separate movie theater for the Black soldiers. Now, this is our friend Archie. He's over on the right. He was from Cairo, Georgia, and that's how you say it. And his job in 42, 43 was as driver. He drove truck around with a lot of trailers attached, moving equipment around on the base, and also driving cadets to and from the train depot to the Boca Raton Club, which is where people were stationed still at that time. And he was with 8th Air Force. You can see him in Europe with his buddies there at left. Archie was able to turn his experience in the military to a profession. He became a professional chauffeur and worked for some very wealthy people. So he did very well with his World War II training. There was lots of messing going on. So it turns out messing means feeding large amounts of people with large amounts of food. I looked it up. The picture at left needs no comment. I just makes me laugh, so I had to throw it in there. The picture to the right shows guys on KP making massive amounts of cornbread, which of course is cheap and filling. Another funny artifact from our collection. It's a linen towel, like in the bathroom. It's actually woven. Boca Raton Field is actually woven into it. I don't quite understand that, but physical training was for everybody, men and women. There were PT fields, as they call them, all over the place. And of course, it was nice, hot, sweaty work. Another funny artifact is this t-shirt. It's made of that real thin, cheap cotton, but it's actually printed on. And I didn't know that they printed t-shirts way back in World War II, but apparently I was wrong. And you can see in the photograph there, a young man in the left there has a similar, but not exactly the same shirt that's also marked Boca Raton Field. Typical barracks, dig that native Boca Raton landscaping. Hot as heck, as you might imagine. And I know from the veterans that they used to take those bunks and turn them parallel to the walls in the summertime, probably. When I was a kid, we grew up without air conditioning. We would, make our bed with our head at the foot of the bed in the summer. You probably did the same to catch the breeze. The lavatories all were equipped with laundry tubs, and the guys had to do their laundry the old-fashioned way, scrubbing. There were women stationed at the base. This cartoon was created by Zach Mosley, creator of Smilin' Jack comics, very well known, and he was Civil Air Patrol. So he was stationed at Morrison Field and Lantana, and he certainly would have known some of the Boca Raton field guys and drew this funny little cartoon for them. We had wax and wands. So the Women's Army Corps, originally the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, by the time we had women at our field, it had morphed into the Women's Army Corps. And wax served mainly clerical and auxiliary roles on the base. Just a note for you, the for you women out there, the WAC uniforms were notoriously ill-fitting and uncomfortable. And in this picture, I think the ladies are wearing stockings and puffy girdles. They don't look very comfy to me. Okay, once again, check out the local landscaping. And on top of that, the place was crawling with rattlesnakes. Funny part of the story, Arnold McSpadden recalled, I might add that the territory around here was crawling with gators and rattlesnakes when we were doing business in 42. I still have a wallet made from an old diamondback rattler from this post, and I would add that many belts and useful articles were made from snake hides. Yes, you had to look pretty sharp for snakes then, and I still look. Upper right are some rattlesnakes rattled from Floresta from the 30s. But you get the idea. Floresta was right next to the base. A little cartoon from one of our band members. And at left, there is Mayor Boone with a rattler caught on the future FAU site when they were starting the pilings in 1960. So guess what, guys? They're still out there. We have at left a WAC working on a radio, at right a secretary working on a typewriter, and a very important function for the WACs was in the planning and execution of entertainment and recreation activities with base, because this was a very important part of base operations. The women tried to make life a little more palatable, a little more homey. You can see the very prosaic men's mess upper left. But at right, the women have tablecloths and little flowers on the tables, and they would decorate their barracks and so on. Here's some nurses, they're lieutenants to you, outside the base hospital. This is the base hospital. Hard to believe, looks like a bunch of double wides stuck together, but it was fully functional with ER, OR, the whole business. Here's the map that our friend Dick Randall made for us. The base hospital was located not far from where Boca Regional Hospital is today. And the buildings of Boca Regional are in green. And you can see the red represents the hospital, the nurses' quarters, and the WAC quarters as well. So that was located kind of south of 7th Street and west of 12th in what is today the Country Club Village neighborhood. So think where that is. And take a look at this picture, because this is what it looked like outside the base hospital. Wow. Nurses worked 12-hour shifts. Of course, they dealt with infectious disease, probably sexually transmitted diseases, accidents, crashes, but they also got to birth babies. And we know of at least 2 who were born in the base hospital. Edith Mize Lewis was a field nurse at BRAF, and she went on to fly 50 successful combat missions as a flight nurse. Wartime entertainment, very important, as I mentioned. So the base had its own bowling alleys and movie theaters, but of course the guys were desperate to get off campus when they had some time off. Now, Boca was such a little town. There were two bars, Zim's, which is where the Elegant Child is on South Federal Highway, and Brown's, which is where Flanagan's is. So they were across the street from each other. And on the east side of the street in the consignment store was, and I am not making this up, the GI Fun House, which Mr. Brown took care of. And it was not as naughty as sort of the name implies. It was, a recreation center. There was also a servicemen's center in town. I'm not quite sure where, run by the local church members and local organizations. But of course, the guys tried to get the heck out of town. You can see them in the lower right catching a ride in front of Brown's. And there was a bus station across the street from Town Hall in what is today Sanborn Square. They would go wherever it was going. So Delray, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm. Their ideal destination, particularly on the weekends, was Miami Beach and the nightclubs there. So you could get it into a lot of trouble down there. But if you couldn't get out of town, we had wonderful beaches. And so where formerly you would have found maybe a handful of people on the beach here in Boca Raton, now there are hundreds and maybe even thousands of guys there, particularly on the weekends. Sports were a very important part of entertaining the troops off when they're not working. There were professional boxers, of course, stationed at BRHS, but they were not allowed to participate in the amateur boxing, which was very, very popular participatory and spectator sport. The guys played football, of course. As a matter of fact, BRHS fielded a football team that played the University of Miami in the Orange Bowl. So this concludes part 2 of our talk on World War II and the Boca Raton field. Be sure and join us next week when we will have part 3, and it's part 10 of our lecture series. Thank you so much for joining us.